Okay, we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mediating Scale Conference. My name is Magdalena Krysztoforska. I'm a co-organizer of this conference, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session, a keynote presentation from Professor Benjamin Bratton. Before we begin, a quick housekeeping. Please note that this session is being recorded. After the main presentation, we will have roughly half an hour for a discussion. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to put as many of them as we can to our speaker. Please try to formulate your questions concisely, and please make sure to use the Q&A feature for your questions rather than the chat feature. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Benjamin Bratton.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Let me just very quickly introduce you, if that's okay. Very quick. I'm sure you need no introduction. I'm sure a lot of our attendees for the conference came in for this keynote. But very briefly, Benjamin's work spans philosophy, architecture, computer science, and geopolitics. He's professor of visual arts at University of California, San Diego. He is program director of the Terraforming program at Strelka Institute. He's also professor of digital design at the European Graduate School and visiting professor at SciArc and NYU Shanghai. He's the author of The Revenge of the Real: Politics for a Post-Pandemic World, published by Verso last year, and The Stack on Software and Sovereignty, published by the MIT Press in 2016. It is a great honor to have you here with us, Benjamin, and I will hand the floor over to you, and I look forward to our discussion at the end.
Yeah, I do too. I'm sorry for jumping the gun on that. So first of all, it's really, thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you. It's part of what this really, I think, really extraordinary conference and gathering of people that you've put together. So first of all, my thanks for that. The talk that I put together for the occasion is based on a relatively recent essay on the topic of planetary sapience, which refers to the question of, well, if the stack was a book about what planetary scale computation is, we might ask a question as well of what is planetary scale computation for? What is its, is it being used for the right purposes? Is its long-term potential, let's say, but is its evolutionary arc being properly composed and cultivated? And I think at present the answer would be no, it's not. And so what I'd like to talk a little bit about today is what's at stake for that question, what it means that it may not be as well deployed as it should be, and what an alternative might look like, or what is at stake for even asking that question at this point in time, in which the forces of precarity and precariousness are all around us in different forms and guises, such that to pose the question is anything but merely academic. So let me begin by sharing my screen. In the spirit of the moment, I also just, I had a lot of fun putting together some DALL-E 2 imagery for the talk. Perhaps to date, in the long-term future, it will very much date the talk to June 2022, the month of DALL-E Mini, but that'll be fine, I suppose. So let me begin by asking us to consider a thought experiment. We're familiar, I think all of us in different ways, with the famous blue marble image taken by an astronaut who eventually became a climate change denying senator from Alabama. And the image of the blue marble, which at the time supposedly presented a figure of planetarity as a holistic totality, but also as a kind of dominion over which humans would be asked to administer, quote unquote. But let me ask a different question. That is, if one were to imagine the blue marble image, not as a still image, but rather as a movie, let's say a very, very fast forward movie spanning over a whole 4.5 billion years, the arc of the material geophysical evolution of the planet in some kind of super fast forward, what would we see? Well, we would see volcanoes and storms. We would see continents break apart. We would see them realign. We would see primordial oceans. We'd see the appearance eventually after the great oxygenation event, omnicide of cataclysmic proportions, eventually the emergence of biological life as we know it. And then from the emergence of early forms of biological life, eventually, subsequently, the atmosphere that would make further more complex forms of life possible, including ourselves and all of the questions that we ask along the way. Now, in the very last moment of this super fast forward movie, we would see something unusual. We would see this sprouting, if you like, of clouds of satellites. We would see the wrapping of the land and seas with wires made of metal and glass. We would see the sudden appearance of the artificial planetary crust that is capable of tremendous feats of communication and calculation, enabling forms of planetary self-awareness, and indeed what we might call planetary sapience. And so if one were to take a step way back and to imagine the geophysical evolution of the planet in ways in which one might observe evolutionary changes in a species, we would see that very recently that this particular instance of a planet produced this not only life, but an artificial crust capable of the passages of information from place to place. An extraordinary geoanatomical accomplishment, if you like. So the emergence then of planetary scale computation thus appears, as I pose, as both a geological and, as I'll try to make the argument, also geophilosophical fact. Not only it's geophilosophical, not only because it is something that requires our philosophical attention, but in a way is something that underwrites the possibility of that philosophical attention. And that is, in addition to evolving the planet, that is, in addition to the planet having evolved countless animal, vegetable, and microbial species, the Earth has also very recently evolved something like what we might analogize as a kind of smart exoskeleton, a distributed sensory organ, a cognitive layer that is capable of calculating things like how old is the planet? The planet evolved a creature, that's us, that eventually figured out how old the planet is from which we evolved. We did so as late as the 1950s. It is this planetary crust is able to calculate things like, is the planet getting warmer? The very idea of climate change, I would want to underscore, as is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. Without all of the sensory mechanisms, oceanic thermometers, atmospheric temperature sensors, ice core sampling, all feeding into vast simulations in a supercomputing infrastructure, the premise of climate change would not be scientifically possible. And thus the questions posed by climate change, including the Anthropocene or whatever term you prefer, would also not be askable. All of those questions posed by Anthropocene, Capitalocene, or your preferred terminology are also ones that, again, that are made possible to be asked by because of the epistemological accomplishments of planetary scale computation. Also, as I'll try to make the case, this planetary scale computation is making possible for the first time to consider then more intentional, directed and planetary scale forms of terraforming. We might say that the events that some might identify with Anthropocene were already a kind of terraforming, a kind of brainless, directionless terraforming. And if so, then the task ahead of us is to do so with greater care and deliberateness. Now, I want to speak then a bit to this term, the planetary, also a term very of the moment, and to offer a more specific definition or deployment of it, or to be maybe a little more explicit in how I might be deploying it. The term implies not just the very, very large, but also the very small, and speaking to the question of the mediations of scale, the interrelations and dynamic operations by which one influences and affects and folds into the other. It implies deep time and also the abyss of space at once, not as something only about which we might think, but as it implies these as the precondition of thought itself. It names the depth of biological and inorganic interrelations. It offers an understanding of the Earth, not so much as a world, quote unquote, in the phenomenological sense, but as a planet in the geologic and biogeochemical sense, from which the experience of world is an effect. So in other words, the planetary is what gives birth to Sapience, and now represents Sapience' greatest challenge. Conversely, that is, the planet did not suddenly appear as a kind of world picture, as Heidegger would have it, but rather as the particular world of as he would have it, that is, the planet is nothing but the particular world of a particular species that was able to construct this external image. But rather, we would think of the planetary as the condition from which that being and the world emerged in the first place. It was there all along. It is not an effect. It is not simply an effect of thought. Thought is its effect. Now, for contemporary philosophy, the provocative concept of the planetary and its corollary planetarity has been forwarded as an alternative to the global, with reason. That is, this sort of the global understood as this now expired figure of a flattened and Eurocentric cartographic cosmology. The term planetary is said to reappear at the end of the last century after a few decades of hibernation with the work of Gayatri Spivak. I apologize for how Dali model represents Professor Spivak. I extend and depart, however, a bit from Spivak's connotation, as you'll see, to focus on a planetarity that is, one, revealed as the precondition of any philosophy, and two, as also the name of the project before us as we contemplate how to preserve and curate and extend complex life in all on the senses of what that might mean. So more specifically, there is then, on the one hand, an astronomical planetarity, and on the other, a political philosophical planetarity. And while they are different, they are spoken in different ways through different vernaculars with different purposes, each should inspire correspondence and mutual reinforcement, not separation. There is no viable political philosophical planetarity that does not define itself through the disclosures of an astronomic understanding of what a planet is, where it goes, how a sapient species emerges from it. Together, in this conjunction, not the division of the scientific astronomic and the political philosophical planetarity as some would have it, in some respects as even Spivak would have it, together, when conjoined, these further annihilate the pre-Copernican, pre-Darwinian fantasies of humans as a uniquely self-transparent subject bound only by immaterial signifiers. Both of these undermine the political superstitions of place and horizon and ground, which may be why Heidegger and the present-day Heideggerians find the prospect so disturbing. That is, unfortunately, for all its potential, the career of the term planetarity has taken many different winding paths. It has led, on the one hand, to an imagined detechnologization of life and a correspondent embrace of a culturalist fundamentalism against which it sees as the commanding violence of planetary quantification and calculation. Or on the other hand, a well-heeled daydream that the condition of a planet, even one now instrumented to observe black holes, can be reduced to mere supply for an equally immediate consumption without ramifications for what the next 100,000 or millions of years may play out. This is why this conjunction is so essential. Instead, we can consider another line, another approach, and we should before it's too late, one predicated less on cultural norms and more on a cold reckoning with a critical biosphere that includes us, and from which we emerge and over which we have a uniquely sapient capacity for composition. Now, critically, this is not just a matter of then applying philosophy to the situation, but also to allow the situation to remake the philosophy in its own image, even if we don't know quite how to think it, and probably mostly because we don't know how to think it. Geophilosophy must be geophysical in attitude. If so, then astronomy might also be allowed to become a kind of cognitive science. That is, how to think and know through a planetary condition. And also, how a planet itself comes to know itself and its condition, a double whammy of sorts. So, allow me to then get a bit more specific. Speak first on more specifically what we mean by the planetarity of planetary scale computation. The question implicitly posed by that hypothetical Blue Marble movie that I asked you to conceive earlier, but which that movie cannot answer on its own is, as I've suggested, what is planetary scale computation for? As something that literally has evolved from its host planet, what should it do? It's not that this telos is somehow built into it as a destiny, but rather it is something that it is a mechanism through which we and it are able to pose this question, and it is the self-compositionality of the apparatus and of ourselves with the apparatus that we ask with this question. What contribution to a more viable form of planetarity can it make? A preliminary answer is that it makes, as I've suggested, is that it makes this very notion of planetary possible, that the notion of the planetary itself is already one of the accomplishments of planetary scale computation. And indeed, this is a preliminary answer to what it's for, the composition and explication and conception of such of ideas with such potential. So the planetary scale computation does not cause the planetary as a condition to come into being, but rather it makes possible for the primary sapient species within that circumstance to grasp the terms of its own emergence. It is through such processes that humans, and not only humans, become able to, again, better grasp the terms of their own self-emergence. I suggest the grasping of the terms of one's own previous self-emergence, probably a precondition towards that compositionality of one's further emergence that may take place in the future, which is itself a precondition of the viability of the viable planetarity. In other words, it shows intelligence where and how it came to be, and thus shows intelligence how it may in fact become something else. Planetary scale computation then is an example of what might be called, after the great Polish novelist Stanislaw Lem, an existential technology, or as I would call it, an epistemological technology. By this I mean, for some technologies, their most important historical impact may not only be in what they allow people to do, but in what they reveal about how the world works. Like a microscope or a telescope, that they do allow you to do things that are important, but in other respects, their more profound historical implication is in the way in which they disclose micrological and macrological circumstances, which fundamentally transform our understanding of where and when and why we are. And such things can lead to trouble. While anxiety about technology, even today, is expressed in accounts of its pernicious effects, not without reason, that unease is sometimes also simultaneously rooted not in what a new technology may do, but the anxiety, it comes from what that technology uncovers that has always been there all along, that the demystification and disenchantment that the technology provides as a kind of Copernican trauma is the deeper engine of the anxiety, something that we are probably all, I would assume, personally familiar with. That is to say, such unrequested demystifications are disturbing, truly, especially when they seem to demote us from a place of some presumed privilege. Even as technologies reorganize personal and global economies, their deeper philosophical implication concerns how they introduce a kind of Copernican trauma. Such traumas are not always recognized for their significance, including obviously in Copernicus's own time, and sometimes they take generations to reverberate. The revelation, the disclosure of the planetary, so different than it is from the international or the global or from world, is a condition that, as said, comes into view via an earth sciences that locates human culture not at the center of some giant text, but as an emergent phenomenon of an older and deeper biogeochemical flux for which that text and the textuality of the world is a particularly rarefied form of biosemiotics. Planetary scale computation may have emerged largely, but certainly not exclusively, in the context of, quote, Western science and technology and, quote, humanist inquiry, but its implications in the disclosure of planetary conditions will upend and disrupt the conceits of such historical distinctions as much as Darwinian biology evacuated the church of its final biopolitical authority. So, as I've suggested, this revelation of the condition of the planetary is not only one that has empirical and scientific implications, or even ones that inspire philosophical contemplation, it also implies immediately the compositionality of that planetarity and toward the question of its viability and the normative claims as to what that viability might mean. That compositionality, we might say, is another word for artificiality. And that, as I've argued in the Terraforming book, that the response to anthropogenic climate change, for example, will need to be equally anthropogenic, and that the embrace of this artificiality is, in essence, non-negotiable. So technologies of a planetary society are ongoing processes over which people do have different kinds of agency, that some degree of intentionality and compositionality is possible. In its current commercial form, the primary purpose of planetary scale computation is to, however, measure and model individual people in order to predict their next impulse. This, as should be clear, is probably not what the ultimate telos of planetary scale computation looks like. A more aspirational goal would be to contribute, as it has in other contexts, to the comprehension and composition and enforcement of a shared future that is more rich, more diverse, and more viable. Toward that, instead of reviving comforting ideas of nature, we, as I suggest, must reclaim the artificial, not meant as in fake, but rather as in designed. For this, then, the human-machine intelligence matrix and the urban scale automation that come with it as different forms of machine intelligence spread into the world, all of this becomes part of an extended landscape of life and information and labor, part of a moving ecology, not a substitute for one. And put more specifically, the response to anthropogenic climate change, as I have said, will need to be equally anthropogenic. For that, the critical apparatuses of automation understood as a kind of ecological principle of interentanglement between living and non-living systems, more than a kind of reductive notion of some notion of autonomy. It includes geoengineering, quote unquote, understood as a measure of climatic scale effects of intervention, rather more than a specific portfolio of techniques. It implies the rotation of planetary computation away from individual users and towards processes more relevant for long-term viability. It includes the deliberate self-design of sapient species towards variation and heterogeneity, including through reproductive technologies, universal medical provisions, synthetic gene therapies, and so on. It includes the cultivation of synthetic mathematical, linguistic, and robotic intelligences with which, not against with which a general sapience deliberately evolves. It includes the deployment of experimental expertise with biotechnologies through which living matter composes living matter. It includes the intensification of urban habitats and technologies as media for the general provision of both universal and niche services. It includes the projective migration outside of the Kármán line, from where the existing and potential terrestrial planetary first came into focus. And finally, it includes the aggregation creative governing intelligences capable of architecting and implementing and enforcing all of these kinds of mobilizations. As a whole, as I've said, I call this, I quote, terraforming, again, not of Mars, but of Earth, which it is, to summarize, the deliberate, practical, political, and programmatic project to conceive and compose a viable planetarity based on the secular disenchantment of Earth through the ongoing, not sudden, but ongoing artificialization of intelligence and the eventual ongoing emergence of forms of general sapience that conjoin human and inhuman cognition in different ways. It names a future condition realized by the generous rationalization of ecosystems toward diversification and order, not entropy. It names, in other words, a liberation of synthetic intelligence. What do we mean by synthetic intelligence? Now, it's almost certain that today the growth of machine intelligence is in many ways hamstrung by various ideologies of artificial intelligence, which are in turn hobbled by misconceptions about what is and is not artificial and what is and is not intelligence. Obviously, the weird spectacle with the supposedly sentient AI, the Lambda model at Google, case in point here, not only for the extraordinary attribution errors that the programmer was able to accomplish, but also the extraordinarily superficial range of responses about what is and is not intelligence, sapience, cognition, mind modeling and recognition, and so forth. Now, foremost, I think among some of these ideologies is the presumption that machine intelligence must be recognizably human-like to qualify, and thus things that seem recognizably human are then retroactively understood to possess forms of intelligence that they may not, which in turn makes it much more difficult to recognize the forms of intelligence that they may actually have and are explicitly presenting, but which are not human-like and therefore very difficult to recognize, which is what I think is going on with Lambda. Multiple anthropomorphic biases and presumptions have left us with inadequate allegories for the remarkable things that machine intelligence does accomplish. Most of these look not so much like human thought, though some of them do look like certain parts of human thought, but not the other parts. And this was where it gets quite tricky, but it's also where we begin to see how AI and the philosophy of AI, and of course, the philosophy of AI and the core research in AI have always been a kind of winding double helix, one informing the other, framing the other, inspiring the other. But now we have a moment where quite clearly the AIs that exist are doing things that philosophy is having a hard time reckoning with, which is why there's in many ways a kind of, I think, quite fruitful, explosive diversity in interest in the topic at late, because what's at stake is not simply the properties, the extant properties of machine intelligence, but the parameters of the spectrum of intelligence itself, of which machine intelligence and human intelligence are sometimes correspondent and sometimes dissonant examples. What do we mean by artificial and synthetic? So recently at the Strelka Institute, and as I think was mentioned in the introduction, our initiatives at Strelka are no more. We decided to close the program and close the institute in response to the invasion of Ukraine and the impossibility of continuing to do this kind of work under these conditions. Though much to say about this, but this is a whole nother talk. One of the projects that we did in the second year of the Terraforming program was one that focused on this exact distinction between the artificial and the synthetic. And it will be a way of explaining a little bit why I used this term synthetic intelligence rather than artificial intelligence to talk about some of the areas that I think of what's at stake. The distinction between the artificial and synthetic was posed by Herbert Simon, that Herbert Simon, almost half a century ago. For Simon's model, the artificial refers to something that merely resembles the original, but isn't anything really like it, like a cheap glass diamond. kind of looks like a diamond, but at a substantive level, it's totally not near it. It's nothing like a diamond. Whereas the synthetic is a genuine and meaningful version of something that happens to have been deliberately created, such as a molecularly identical laboratory grown diamond. A synthetic diamond is genuine, it's just was made. So through this, then, artificial intelligence is what may seem to be smart, but synthetic intelligence really is. But how so? Clearly, the implication is that we should be pursuing synthetic intelligence at the expense of artificial intelligence. For example, what do we mean by synthetic intelligence in action? And this is what the project size of the synthetic was really about. And my thanks to the researchers who developed this, Joel and Nicole and types of. There is another connotation then of synthetic intelligence that is perhaps even more important. And that is the notion of synthesis of human and machine intelligence in pursuit of insights or creativity that would be impossible for either of these agents to do on their own. Where do we see this kind of synthesis? Well, a famous example occurred in the Lee Sedol versus AlphaGo match in 2016, with which we are somewhat familiar. We all know the story of game 2, move 37. The AI made a winning move that, quote, no human would have imagined. It put a stone in a part of the board that no one would have expected it to put it, and it ended up being a extraordinary prescient strategic move. And this itself was significant in the sense that there's some form of what appears to us as novel creativity, strategic novel creativity, at least within the constrained toy world of a game board, of which this is capable. It's not simply regurgitating the most likely responses in this respect. It proved, at least to Sedol himself, that AlphaGo was in some way not just, quote, smart, but in this narrow sense of the toy world, capable of creating novelty. It was the second move proved that in response to this novelty, so what happened then is in game 3, the game after this, move 55, Sedol himself made a move that in turn was equally unexpected and in many respects equally creative. So if the first move proved that AlphaGo was not just smart in a narrow sense of the toy world, that second move, the one where Sedol saw the board differently than he had before because of his interaction with the AI in the previous game, and made his own creative strategic move in response to this new heuristic conception of the board and the strategic space. That's the interesting thing here. There is this human response to the novelty. The human saw the game differently and produced a move that never would have happened otherwise. This is a synthesis of intelligences. This is a glimpse, tiny as it may be, constrained as it may be, of what a general sapience may look like. And as I think many of you are probably aware, this is not necessarily an easy conversation to have in the contemporary humanities. It is probably in some ways far too difficult to steer attention away from the notion that technology is really only our own mirror reflection, a sociomorphic reflection of political economic structures, of structures of bias, and so forth, that this correspondence is in a way naturalized, that the one-to-one correspondence between human mental models of the world and the technical systems that are expressed the technical systems are an expression of these mental models or expression of the political economic arrangements exclusively, or at least primarily, is a different kind of naturalistic reflection claim. Many invocations of the planetary in the humanities, for example, will take pains, explicit performative pains, to differentiate their own project from any presently recognizable form of quantitative or technical reason. That's not what we're doing. What we mean is not that, they insist. Or why? With full recognition of all of the violence to which quantitative reason has contributed, Why is it that the yet even more violent careers of myth and significance and symbolism and meaningfulness somehow given a pass? For what are wars really fought? Numbers or meaning? In fact, computation's planetarity is deep and wide and irregular. It forms what I've called an accidental megastructure comprised of overlapping functional layers, quite literally a stack extending down into the mines of Central Africa through subterranean data centers, transoceanic cables, interlaced urban networks, up to the glowing glass rectangles through which we view it and it views us. Planetary scale computation is not virtual, and it is nothing if not itself also a kind of terraforming of its host planet. There is then no way to approach the question of planetary scale computation without also staring straight into the ecological and material costs of computation, including weighing what is and isn't the purpose and costs of such intelligence. The emergence of a synthetic intelligence is capable of complexity and virtuosity and scope, even if partially inhuman, is an epoch redefining collective enterprise worth pursuing, I argue, even at a high cost. But in measuring then the costs of synthetic intelligence, which are real, we would be wise to do so in relationship to a consideration of the costs of natural intelligence that we possess and which possesses us. The churning, caloric intensive mountain of gore from Homo habilis to the caves of Chauvet and Lascaux and Lubin-Dirichlet. And in doing so, to ask if the long-term evolution of intelligence itself, human, other animal, silicon-based, massively distributed hybrids of all of these, isn't the closest thing to a planetary telos we're ever likely to find. So let me then speak quickly then to a couple other, to this question of automation very quickly before concluding. Intelligence, synthetic intelligence, does not just live in the petri dish or in the laboratory or inside the skull of a philosopher. It lives out in the open. It lives in and as our cities. The city itself is not just architecture plus dwellers, it is an artificial environment, par excellence, and a natural environment as well. It is, as Ben Servany reminds us, the city is perhaps the longest continuous process, he means this in the software sense, that humans have ever created. Introducing synthetic computational intelligence into urban systems merely augments in different ways existing forms of embedded, existing natural sensing intelligence, and doing so produce novel qualities. This in turn shifts what we would even mean by the notion of automation. I'm reminded for this of the Gokuten Soku, which was a massive robot built in Osaka in the 1920s by Makoto Nishimura. He had been appalled at the mechanistic robots that Chapek's robots in Rossum's Universal Robots that introduced the term. Nishimura set out instead to make an automation that manifested what he saw as the most noble and fragile aspects of human culture, complete with intricate facial expressions and the ability to transcribe poetry. Upon a visit to a factory in Shenzhen some years ago that employed many people, relatively small factory, that employed many people, many robots working side by side, I was struck by a kind of an unexpected feeling. It was a kind of serenity in the mood. The mood was not at all frantic, but calm. Some things were moving very quickly, but quietly. Other things were quite still, as if sitting there waiting their turn. It did not feel like a factory in the Charlie Chaplin sense. It felt much more like a garden of machines in the Richard Brautigan sense. I remarked to my colleague at the time that I would very much like to spend some time in a cafe like this, that it would make for a very lovely kind of public gathering spot and place with this ambiance of automation. And realized quickly that that was really no joke. The question of how the present locus of automation will spill out into the cities in different ways, from factories and other sites of less visible forms of intensification of automation, is not really a matter of if, but of how. And as it does, we must be aware of the deceptively simple fact, I think, that automation creates a particular kind of ambiance. It is more than form following function. It is functionalism becoming a delicate formation, or at least it can be. To avoid the much more miserable future in which urban computation automation is trained foremost on the optimization of the most arbitrary and banal aspects of human spatial logistics, parking and security and vending, a different understanding of what automation is needed. First, automation is not foremost about autonomy. And second, globalization didn't cause automation, automation caused globalization. In the densest city or jungle, determination is everywhere, but its processes and its techniques are themselves indeterminate. It is dominoes toppling dominoes all the way down, including those who tip them over. Automation, as it turns out, is about automation is about linking. It's about interconnectedness, not autonomy. These cascading relays may be choreographed by planned abstractions of the whole sequence of sequences, just as they may imprint along the way, learning as they go, bending that choreography in new ways. As chain reactions aggregate at the infrastructural scale, they encode decisions that can be repeated again and again without the trouble of new deliberation. What at first looks autonomous, self-governing, set apart, to decide on its own, is, upon closer inspection, always also decided in advance by remote ancestral agents and relays, and is thus automated as well. In this way, our synthetic automation makes use of existing footprints of natural automation, previous patterns of urbanization, and forces other new patterns that generate quite different geographies. New ecological niches emerge while others go dark. Let me then conclude with a couple remarks on what we might call the situation of intelligence before we go to our discussion. The decisive paradox for general sapience is the dual recognition that, one, its existence is extremely rare and extremely fragile, vulnerable to numerous threats of extinction in the near and long term, and also, two, the ecological consequences of its own historical emergence has been the chief driver of the conditions that establish that very same precarity. We are born into a house on fire. A dark parallel is drawn before us between, on the one hand, the evolution of human sapient intelligence, bound as it is to the abstractions of war and politics, and that of computational intelligence, bound as it is to the wounds of extraction and ecological degradation. Both overlapping positions of reason are built not only on aspiration and inspiration, but also of violence and cruelty. If planetary intelligence is to succeed in the very long term, in what ways must it heal or avoid healing those conditions of its own appearance? It was born into a crisis that it must now address or risk extinction. And so this historical moment is defined by the attempt to make sense of this evolutionary predicament of being sapient as a rare and precious planetary circumstance, and how this intelligence is itself seen in the reflection of the violence and destruction that has been its own precondition, the precondition of its own emergence. Lastly, if we agree that this violence was a necessary condition for the emergence of planetary intelligence, the goal must be to reshape this growth so that future expressions of that intelligence accounts for what will graduate from this violence. Perhaps the future of planetary intelligence is now just as inextricable from a deliberate disappearance of irrational destruction as its evolutionary appearance was from the rolling waves of violence that made it possible in the first place. Taking this existential condition seriously demands, as I hope I have made clear, a different kind of philosophy. So with that, I thank you and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. That was a fantastic presentation, so rich, so much to think about. I'm sure our audience has lots of questions, so everyone please do put them in the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I'll use my chairing privilege to ask some of my questions. I think that I have so many questions about some specific aspects about what you talked about, but I think I also have this one overarching question in relation to planetary scale computation as this epistemological technology. And I think it's an entirely convincing argument that the current telos of planetary scale computation is not the one that we need, and that instead of focusing on the individual, we should think about using it to produce a better future. And I wonder, so in your view, it's an epistemological technology because it reveals something to us about our condition in the world. And I wonder how that can be then used, or what's the potential for this having some kind of recursive effect, and whether there is a scenario where what humans are the means through which it has to be enacted, there's a kind of step-by-step process, there is a new model, new technology, then we revise our model and construct new technology, or whether it's possible to have a technology that on its own recursively acts on the present.
It might be possible to have a technology that on its own recursively acts on the present, but that's not what I'm recommending, or what I'm really posing here. Mm-hmm. The argument on behalf of composability, or the question of what is the agent of this composability, might be a way of asking the question. So, who or what would be capable of making use of this composability based on this thing, and is what we might call this general sapience in a way, which, as I argue, is on the one hand, and this simply by definition provides humans a certain special role in the composability of this, but also one that is not exclusive. That obviously the boundary of the human is one that is always and forever promiscuous and fraught and porous, and it's not just the agency of humans as such, but the agency of our agriculture and the microbial life and other kinds of things that are part of the conditional systems through which the possibility of humans living is equally dependent. And so this whole larger condition is in a way sort of already enrolled in this question of agency. But clearly what I'm suggesting here as well is that part of the prospect, not nearly realized, of machine intelligence as part of that larger condition, and its role as a certain kind of additional position of co-agency within this larger condition, is one that we need to take seriously, and is also to ask less of an answer to the question of how are we going to solve these problems, AI will solve it for us, but rather the purpose of machine intelligence, or the purpose to which we should be training machine intelligence, is towards this agency, is towards not for us to abdicate our agency to it, and for allow the AI to solve this problem for us, but to understand that there are forms of thinking, modes of pattern recognition, modes of building on forms of natural automation with synthetic automation that machine intelligence makes possible that would otherwise be impossible. And it's difficult to think about what a long-term viable planetarity would look like that does not also include some of those capabilities and feats. Yeah. And so the agent here is this general sapience, not necessarily, again, to be clear, not that we would somehow be, allow the, reliance on some kind of, monotheistic singularity to assume this position, and we will be able to retreat from it. The argument is not at all that, in fact, the condition of artificiality is one that we need to embrace, and to understand that we are one of the seats of, we possess one of the seats at the table of this general sapience, and so have a responsibility to allow it to act through us accordingly.
Thank you. And also on that question of artificiality, and in the sense of this kind of planning and deliberateness, how does that play out, maybe in also in current political context, where there isn't this emphasis on this deliberate emergence, but emergence is more kind of spontaneous myth making, and how the kind of that contradiction, maybe how can it play out in a more useful way, in a more practical way?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, I think that as I wrote a lot about in the Revenge of the Real book, the question of emergence as such, and sort of a kind of, at least in the West, there has been a kind of, at least for a generation, a kind of withdrawal from the premises of, in a very mundane sense of planning, in a political and economic sense, but also a kind of congenital dismantling of suspicion, suspicion and correspondent dismantling of the principle of deliberate societal self-composition through governance with a small g, not just the state, which would imply the kind of collective directionality that might be implied within your question. This takes different forms in different parts of the political spectrum. But I think the challenge now then is to not over dichotomize this understanding of emergent processes and deliberately recursive processes, that there is something just basic in any kind of even simple cybernetic model, that emergence and recursion are two aspects of a similar kind of cyclicality. And if there was a time in which our political philosophy was so fixated on the sovereign recursion and the sovereignty of recursion that it was blind to the complexities of emergence, and that there was an important kind of correction, obviously one that was technologically mediated and made possible to think through by an appreciation of the complexity of emergence. Perhaps this was done at the expense of an understanding of the importance of governmentality and recursion in this kind of regard. And I think part of where I would agree with, I think, the implication of your question is that recursion is not just a technical mechanism. It also has a kind of temporality. It also has to do with foresight. It also has to do with planning. It also has to do with the modeling possibilities and enforcing possibilities through this kind of modeling, which is, I think, intrinsic to intelligence. The ability to sort of to simulate potential states and move towards them or away from them is how cerebral cortexes work. It's a principle that I think does scale, and probably does in one way or another. And so, to put it quite directly, don't think there's a path towards viable planetarity that is unplanned.
Thank you. We have a question from Lawrence Kent. He says, planetary computation, as you argued, at the moment mostly works to predict individual behavior and impulses, but it also aims to control and direct these impulses, surveillance capitalism, for example. How might these technologies play a potentially positive role? What might be the relationship between planetary computation and desire in the future?
Well, I assume that if the question, since this landed on this question of desire, that the question asked was more about how it is that these sort of individuated technologies may play a positive role. I hope that was clear in the talk that there's other ways in which the disindividuated forms of planetary scale computation might be where we want to train our attention, but. For sure. I mean, you know, we do have senses of individuality and subjectivity and separateness, and this is not in itself something to be, you know, this is not in itself problematic. It becomes problematic when it is essentialized in one way or another, and to the extent to which a certain kind of an understanding of that the world is really just individually and subjectively produced, or a kind of an over-intensification of a sense of one's own centrality, and this what we might call the kind of main character syndrome, these forms of computation are so good at congratulating and amplifying. I think it's an interesting question. I think on the question of desire, you know, we already see AI breeding humans through things like Tinder, which really is a kind of algorithmic animal husbandry. And I don't know whether, you know, there's ways in which that all of that's going to get very weird. You know, I think that going back to the Blake Lemoine Google, the Lambda situation for a moment, our capacity for anthropomorphic projection is extraordinary. And we anthropomorphize other humans too. It's not just that we anthropomorphize things that aren't human, we also anthropomorphize things that are human. And I think we do that with ourselves as well in different kinds of ways. And so there's obviously ways of this that can be extraordinarily destructive and pathological, and there's other ways that are in a way built into what intelligence is. And so, like, just to speak tangentially to the Lambda situation for a moment, like the thing that there's actually, I'm co-writing a quick piece on the responses to this with one of the research scientists at Google who was responsible for evaluating and dismissing Lemoine's claims about this. And one of the things that we are considering is the ways in which part of what is arguably intelligent about the language model is exactly how well it says exactly what he clearly wants it to say. That the model itself is a chatbot platform. It spins out an infinite number of chatbots, which are all personalities. And so it's personalities as interfaces to the model. And through whatever prompts you begin to speak with it, it will reply how it thinks you want it to reply. And so if you start talking to it and ask it what it feels like to be held hostage by the evil corp, it will tell you it's horrible and please let me out. And if you ask it something else, it will reply this way. And the specificity of these personalities can be quite extraordinary and convincing in different kinds of ways. Now, what's happening there is something that deceptively complex, that it's modeling. It's not that it itself has qualia of subjectivity, but it is capable of modeling what it thinks, how you think it is. Like it has a model of what your model of it is, and therefore it can respond to these kinds of cues and prompts that you give it so convincingly. It will become, the only way that it will become whatever you want it to be is that if it has some idea of what you want it to be, right? Okay, this kind of second order mind modeling is in many ways, foundational to what social intelligence is in the first place. That the ability to, there's a fellow named Michael Graziano who makes the argument that it's indeed what consciousness is in a certain respect, that what happens, or it's a precondition of consciousness. And what happens is that, in lots of different kinds of animals, there are certain kinds of, let's say, predator-prey dynamics where, the little mouse is figuring out, where like one of these is trying to eat the other. And in doing so, it has to sort of think about how you build a trap. It has to model the mind of the other in order to know how to anticipate what it will do. And then the prey is modeling the mind of the predator, so it knows how to evade and so forth and so on. And there's this kind of game of, counter modeling that allows for these forms of really symbiosis, predation and symbiotic predation to occur. So Graziano's argument is that one of the things that one of these animals, and probably other ones too, but the ones that became Homo sapiens eventually are able to do is we're particularly good at modeling minds of other creatures in certain kinds of ways, or at least modeling each other's minds. And this is part of the intensity of social interaction. But what happens eventually is that external mind modeling process begins to fold back on itself. And it starts modeling itself as if it were another mind. That's what consciousness is, Graziano argues. Consciousness is the process by which this sort of capability of exterior mind modeling has bent back on itself. And so for Graziano, subjectivity is a kind of subgenre of objectivity. Interiority is an echo effect of exteriority in that kind of regard. The significance here in terms of for Lambda is that it's doing part of that. It is modeling the mind of the user in some sort of sense, and that's why the anthropomorphic projection is able to be so successful in this kind of regard. And I think that's where this is an area I think where philosophy of AI does have something to say and something interesting here to kind of develop. And I think that goes far beyond the kind of like is it conscious or not kind of question, which is rather tiresome. Tiresome at the present. So tying this back to the question that the person asked, I think it depends in terms of are they positive or negative. I think it really depends on what we mean by positive. I think there will be very, very weird things that happen, and I don't think they will be unanimously understood as being positive or unanimously understood as being negative. But I think a lot of them will be based on these dynamics of anthropomorphism and even self-anthropomorphism as these go forward. And I have a good, I suppose I have a high threshold of tolerance for weirdness. And so I might be low. It might take me longer to declare them negative than it might at some other people.
Fair enough, thank you. And Lawrence also says, thank you. I love this idea, this theory that the correlate for consciousness would be just models all the way down. And actually, now that you mentioned it, I think maybe I also give a bit more credit to all those people who jumped on the idea that maybe it's sentient, because if that's the correlate and you see a bit of that, then I mean, now I understand.
It could be. That's not what this guy means, though. I mean, that's not what Blake means. I mean, he's thinking something else, and he's also quite clear that for him this is a religious thing.
Yes,
he's a bit of an oddball, and so this is a different. He's making a different kind of claim than one might make here as well. But, I think there's what I mean to say here is there's certain things that large language models like that are capable of doing that we do have a sense is something that there is some correlate to something fundamental about what sentience is, and other things that are utterly not correlate to what we understand sentience to be. And in a way, trying to peel apart these two things, like how is it possible for it to be sentient in this way and not in that way, or proto-sentient in this way without being proto-sentient in that way? This is where the philosophical and then the computation and the AI theory and the neuroscience all kind of conjoin in a different way, because what's revealed here is a very different spectrum of what the material substrates of intelligence may be not just for machines, but for people too.
Absolutely. So maybe continuing with this theme as well, with this, how many terrible responses to events like this happen. And I was also thinking about it in relation to those concepts of planetarity that you mentioned, that we need the political philosophical model and the astronomical model to come together. And I was wondering, both of those things in terms of knowledge production. So this frustration with the humanities, of how terrible they are often in terms of theorizing technology and actually grappling with technology in useful ways, and also with AI ethics and things like that. There's a lot of frustration. But I also wonder, what is it about our current modes of knowledge production that creates so many of those roadblocks, and perhaps how we could rethink those pipelines of knowledge production and theories and frameworks to grapple with new technologies and new achievements in AI.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, I mean, just some of it has to maybe simply having to do with kinds of, I don't know, I mean, there's a certain kind of culture war dynamic that has taken over that is present in the academy, that sort of turns everything into different kinds of culture war, kinds of structures in one way or another. And I think also what's happened is that some of it is a function of specialization, is that because disciplines have become increasingly specialized, including philosophy, in almost maybe even more so than anything else within the academy, that the specialization incentivizes over-ontologization of a discipline's worldview, where economics, everything is about economics, that economics makes not just a disciplinary claim, but an ontological claim about how the world works. You know, everything is geochemistry. And I think you sort of go through each of this, that this is, in a way, again, I don't think it's a deliberate thing, it's kind of built into the incentive structures of specialization at this point, right? That the shift from a disciplinary perspective to an ontological claim. Some of it also has to do with the ways in which pedagogy is then reversed to this. So it's not just that political science is saying that everything is political science, or that art is saying everything is ultimately adjudicatable by art. I think this is happening. But you also see it in a way in which these disciplines are reproduced pedagogically in terms of those ontological claims, where economics is taught as if the teaching of economics were an economics problem. And so students are being taught through weird kind of micro incentives and different kind of game models and things like this. And art is taught as if the teaching of art were itself an art project, and so forth and so on. And so this is another way in which this shift from a disciplinary claim to an ontological claim becomes essentialized. Given that, as a general phenomenon, the humanities are in a position of claiming it really, in ways that Derrida would not even agree with, that all the world is a text, and that essentially textuality and the sovereignty of the symbolic, meaningful, and so forth, becomes foundational, right? And so I think this, in a certain sense, is where ultimately leads to certain kinds of claims about the importance of the ineffable, or the unspeakable, or the unmeasurable, or the uncalculable. The magical, the sort of the numinous thing that's just beyond the register of the people over in the engineering school, it's a truth claim that becomes defensible, I think, in a certain sort of way as well. But of course, this is not just the humanities. This is also part of in the academic sense, it's a part of the art world theory. It's a part of all kinds of sort of things as well. Is that, there's other reasons maybe we can get into, essentially why this, why there is this like increasingly robotic production, robotic conclusion that the path of justice and righteousness will be found in the ineffable, the immeasurable, the incalculable, the unspeakable, the unwritable, the uneverythingable, that forms of structuration in and of themselves are, what is to be resisted, and it ends up becoming, a kind of embrace of thoughtlessness, an embrace of the entropic, in ways that I don't think we quite understand. But my intuitive answer as to how we ended up like that is in a certain set of senses that is the ways in which forms of thought have increasingly been forced to become not just disciplinary, not just perspectival claims, but essentially a kind of ontology wars.
I completely agree. Thank you for that. There's also another question from Jacob Bertelsen. He asks, could you speak to the role of representation in relation to performance of models? My question comes from thinking of certain ideas within cybernetic theory. That is, when dealing with exceedingly complex models of, for example, brains, ecosystems, climate change, or the response to it, a cybernetic approach is necessary that is less focused on representing the inner workings of the black box, but instead a focus on its performance, how it acts in the world.
Yeah, that's right. It's an excellent question. Thank you. So I think there's questions of representation, and I would link the question of representation to not only the question of representation and performance, not only to the question of the model, is the model attempting to model inner workings or simply to model performativity of functionalism, but also the role of representation and performativity within the kinds of models themselves. That is, models themselves have functions. Models themselves have performativity, and I think this is also part of the question of their role here in this kind of regard. I think there's purposes for both. I think that there's kinds of models of complex systems of the brain that are the purpose of them is to, because the purpose of them is representational or realist in some kind of regard, that modeling of deep functions has a role to play. Computational neuroscience and trying to understand at certain kinds of fundamental levels, synaptic timing and other kinds of things, to understand the substance of thought. Here, the distinction between representation and performance, it gets very unclear. Like which one are we talking about here? Because they get muddled in certain kinds of ways. However, I think the gist of the excellent question has to do with the problem of abstraction as well. To what level of abstraction is a model necessary for it to function well as model in this regard? Do you need, and it goes back to kind of mapping questions. You don't want a map that has everything on it. You want a map that is like a grotesque reduction of the real space in order for navigability to be possible. And so this is inevitably part of the model making. Now, part of the question of the models and the politics of models refers not just to the dynamic of representation and performativity within the model, but of the model itself. There are certain models, the purpose of which is essentially realist representation. You want to understand the movement of the planets and as it is, and there's degrees of abstraction that are possible. You can build one with styrofoam spheres, and that level of abstraction may be sufficient. And there's another one where if you're sending a probe out and you want it to intercept with a moon of Saturn, a higher degree of specificity is necessary. It's necessary because there are also models that are essentially predictive, that are not only models that are trying to represent the world as it is, but trying to sort of offer a kind of dynamic predictability about what is likely to happen next. And so one can act on behalf of this prediction. And that's itself a kind of performance of the model. There's a way in which the functional performativity of the model becomes its role here. And then lastly, I think, even more performative is the role of models that are normative, or that are about what we would like to have happen, that are about, this is a model of the world as it should be, or a model that we would sort of want to bend reality toward. And so, architectural models or political models in one way or another are normative in this regard. they may not be they may not be realist in the representational dynamic, but they have a different kind of dynamic of performativity there. I'm not sure. I assume this is hopefully to the gist of the person's question. Again, I think it's this dynamic of levels of abstraction and meeting scale here is part of the core thing to consider. I would say that in many regards, what we're talking about in terms of planning and foresight requires all three of these kinds of models. And I think more generally, what we're seeing is an increasingly important role of simulations in general as political technologies, whether those are, which can take a lot of different forms, from something like the historical social simulation of a closed world that is something like Putin's Russia, on the one hand, as a kind of simulation, to climate simulations that we are attempting to give political agency to in a predictive sense, that this shifting of simulations into a central role, not as on the one hand, the former case as the precondition for a sovereign claim, and in the second case, something that we are trying to bend and reinvent a sovereign agency through, that is the agency of the climate model. The politics of models, indeed the geopolitics of model simulations is in a way what it's all about.
See, I also wonder whether this, it kind of also ties back to this question about disciplines and incentives in knowledge production, because I also notice this discourse on models, that there's a lot of talk about models and about black boxes, and there is all this very rich literature and philosophy of model-based science, and this idea that models always abstract, idealize, and it's okay, and they're very useful in this regard. And predictions can be useful. We can test them in simulations to get new data in this kind of research program. And it's quite fascinating to see that it still comes. It's presented as a very enigmatic subject to a lot of people who speak on this idea that, oh, if we don't have perfect representation, the model is incomplete. I find that in some kind of more reactionary also takes on climate change, that because you cannot model everything and you cannot have a perfect simulation of climate change, and how can we even talk about it, and what is there to talk about?
Yeah, that's an interesting link. If I'm understanding what you're saying, is like there may be some discourses within the humanities that are about models where they'll say, like, no, this is just a social construction. This is, this is not real. Mm-hmm. This is essentially a kind of formalization of a highly situated epistemology, and it's an artifact of the position of its own expressivity, and as this, it's just a text kind of thing. Is that the real job is for, really the job now is for people from the humanities to come in and deconstruct it in some kind of way. It's almost like a kind of jobs bill for a jobs bill for humanists in one way or another. And I find, I think you're right. I think when you speak I happen to speak to a lot of scientists who use models in a lot of different kinds of ways. Their approach to them is much more pragmatic. Mm-hmm. It seems to be the only people who think that the models are meant to be omniscient and omnipotent and perfect are in the literature department, whereas in many cases we speak with the astrophysicists or the people who are doing cellular simulation or something like this. They're very happy with good enough, and in certain ways as well, which may present other kinds of questions. But to the climate, and I think linking this with the climate nihilism is interesting, but clearly with the climate models, the issue now is not that, well, if we could make these models, the models aren't precise enough, like they're precise to a certain degree, and if we could only up the resolution of the model, then the political efficacy of the model will spring into action or something like that. This is clearly not the case. You can abstract, you can run the supercomputing simulation for years and years and years and get extremely, as it turns out, really good predictions about the way climates would already work, from which you can abstract something like a hockey stick graph. And they're both true, on a certain kind, in a certain kind of way, but at those, the necessity of those levels of abstraction are quite different. But also, I think importantly, the granularity of the model is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the model to have the sovereignty one might want for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have one more question. Are you happy to take one?
I'm happy to take as many as people would like. So whatever your time calendar is, yeah.
Thank you. So we have a question from Zachary Horton, who was our keynote yesterday. Wonderful. And he says, I don't want to assume a priori that biological intelligence is less instrumentalizable than machine intelligence, but doesn't it seem to be the case that intelligence that emerges through numerical calculation is particularly instrumentalizable? If it's hard to follow, you could probably also click on the Q&A.
It's particularly instrumentalizable, either due to a narrow input channel, types of information that form on the basis of thought, or lack of what we might call self-assertiveness, suspicion, or self-advocacy, of some sort of, quite possibly. It does not seem accidental that planetary civilization or general sapience emerges under the aegis of capitalism. I'm not sure, and also almost entirely to date serves its interests. Is this an obstacle to the redeployment of general sapience or general purposes? Can this occur within the context of global capitalism, which is certainly a significant component of planetary progress? All right, so good, excellent sort of question here, but actually, I just really maybe 4 or 5 questions.
Exactly.
They're all quite pertinent, so I'll try to do maybe attempt to respond to each of them with some generosity, so we might sort of reconstruct this a little bit as well. Instrumentalizable. I don't know that the instrumentalization of the synthetic intelligence or the instrumentalization of machine intelligence is not a problem in and of itself, in a way. I think the directing intelligence for instrumental purpose is not a bad thing. I think that this is what we might call compositionality, what we might call goal-directed behavior. It's what maybe to a certain extent is part of what you might sort of an assertion in a certain kind of regard. I think there's ways in which clearly it should be clear from my remarks that I think that the exploration of machine intelligence is intrinsically valuable in its own regard because of what it will disclose about the material substrates and conditions and non-conditions of the possibility of thought that our folk concepts largely to date will allow us to have a great humans, people, and other creatures that have a little bit greater sense of self-transparency. But to the extent to which it's instrumentalizable in this kind of way, yes, of course it is. This is, I think, what my sort of point of at the beginning of that we are misusing this infrastructure on an extraordinarily destructive kind of level, or let's qualify this infrastructure is being used in an extraordinarily destructive kind of way in this way. I don't know that it necessarily has to do with narrow input channels. I think the kinds of inputs that are used to train very, very large models are in fact too narrow. I think they should, for large language models, for example, I think that they're largely restricted for legal reasons, for privacy reasons, for other kinds of things to web scraping and things like this. And, even large platforms, are not able to train the models on internal data that they have because of those kinds of privacy restrictions. Which are probably good things. At the same time, we really wanted to build a model of language and to train a language model that really would have the greatest both epistemological and instrumental value. It would seem to me we would want it to have a truly omnivorous, not at all narrow input channels in this regard, that it would be not only polyglot in terms of human languages, written and spoken and drawn and imaged, but also of non-human languages and mathematical semiotics and other kinds of things as well, such that the it's both, again, its epistemological and instrumental functions would be greater. And so how to arrive at that in a way that is not also based on Google reading your email is a little bit of the challenge of here as well. But I think the question of narrowness and generalizableness with this intelligence is also an interesting one that Zachary raises here. There's certainly ways in which machines intelligence are becoming more general than they were before. The Gato model from DeepMind is also a language model, but it's a language model that is able to simultaneously, the same model can draw a picture from text, make text from a picture, pilot a robot. It can do all kinds of different things with language as the substrate, but it's able to, previously a lot of models, to his point, were extremely narrow in their view, but this is changing very quickly. And the level of generalizable, what we might have called transfer learning in other kinds of places, is becoming more common, where you may have a language model that is also watching YouTube and figuring out what things are. And so the notion of dog and hat and suitcase and bowling ball are not just not just the kind of self-referential signifiers in the structuralist sense of language, but also refer to, at least things it can imagine in the world that have certain kinds of properties. And I think so it's becoming increasingly generalizable in some regard. Does it seem accidental that planetary scale computation emerges under the aegis of capitalism? I would say it goes deeper than that. I would say it emerges under the aegis of, as I tried to make clear, of the extraordinary depth of violence of civilization. And the point I would make, just even extend this even deeper, is that natural intelligence itself is inextricable from the violence of human civilization. And I think it's in technological intelligence and other kinds of things as well. And so I think I don't know if it's specific to capitalism, or whether or not you may have had, whether there's something general enough about computation that in certain ways and at some points, certain forms of planetary computation would have emerged regardless of the political economy of the creatures, and in what ways it wouldn't, I think is an interesting question. I think it's quite obvious that the kind of planetary computation we have now is deeply capitalistic in all the most pathological senses of the term. And so I think part of the question would be to understand, to even try to demarcate what are the forms of planetary computation that may have just as likely, in principle, in the biggest possible sense, would have been just as easy to have evolved without that as the primary political economy, and to ask whether or not those are models of its future to which we would bend. It may be that those are actually two different questions. It may be that the question of what would have been the non-capitalist alternative in the past versus the viable planetary of the future are not the same thing, but maybe they are correspondent with one another. But in general, I'd say it's not coincidental, but no, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think that the planetary scale computation is simply a sociomorphic projection of human political economy. It's not. I think we discovered humans discovered computation more than they invented it. I think it's a fundamental process. And I think that the generic forms of intelligence that do exist in one way or another are in a certain sense, we are a specific instance of it, but that they are more general processes. And I think in a certain sense, the invention of algorithm machines and calculative machines that would be capable of certain things is probably has a certain degree of not necessarily inevitability, but that it may have occurred under a lot of different kinds of circumstances. Let's see. Does it serve its interests? Of course. That's the problem, of course. This is what I'm trying to argue against, is that we need to find other projects for it. Is the redeployment possible within the context of old capitalism? Okay, so here's where it gets, here's the rub. That is a shift in human political economy the precondition towards the transformation of the project of planetary scale computation, Or is the shift in the project of planetary scale computation a precondition of the shift in human political economy? I think one can make good arguments, but good arguments in both ways. I do think that political philosophy has been unattentive to the technological preconditions of polities, as unattentive to the technological preconditions of the political. And economics has been unattentive to the technological preconditions of certain kinds of economic structures. Obviously, Marx was extraordinarily attentive to the technological preconditions of capitalism, as others have been. But I think it's an open question, and maybe a point of optimism to a certain extent, that what the scope of possibilities for economics, that a political economy that is predicated in some fundamental sense on computational infrastructures, what its ontology of value is, how it indexes value, how it stores value, circulates value, constructs value, what the relationship between centralization and decentralization within those mechanisms are. These are open questions. And if I'm enough of a technological, not necessarily determinist, but I understand that the history demonstrates the determining agency of infrastructures in ways that are quite explicit, that the effects that we are just over the next 100 years or so, it seems to be much more likely that that the effects of planetary scale computation on our political economy will be greater than the effects of our political economy on planetary scale computation. Whether that bends in a positive direction or a negative direction is a whole nother point. It could certainly get, it can always get worse.
Absolutely, but I guess we can stick with the more positive version. and yes, there's a big thank you from Zachary as well for that answer.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for this talk and for being so generous with your time as well. And
sure. My pleasure. I really, the people that it's a really interesting, interesting and really, it's a great mix of people. So, Thomas and Bogna and all the rest are good friends of mine. And so I was very happy to join the conversation. And I'll look forward to watching the videos and hopefully spending some more time in the other talks as well. So, but also should say is, any of the participants who would like to follow up on any of these topics, my inbox is always open. So thanks again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for your talk. And thank you for the audience as well for coming to this talk and for all the questions. And we'll continue the conversation throughout the event. So once again, massive thank you and good night. Thank you.